Welcome to session 325 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 21st of November. Today we'll be looking at 2 Thessalonians 1-3 and Psalm 15. But first of all, let's get an overview of 2 Thessalonians. While it's widely accepted that 1 Thessalonians was written by Paul, there are some who argue that 2 Thessalonians was written after Paul by one of his disciples. That they picked up the ideas found in 1 Thessalonians and unpacked them further. Tradition has Paul writing 2 Thessalonians shortly after 1 Thessalonians after getting feedback from his first letter. The Thessalonians are facing even more persecution than they were before, and they're even more unsure of Jesus' return. What causes some to doubt this is how developed Paul's theology suddenly is in 2 Thessalonians when so little time has passed. Either way, as with some of the other disputed letters, either Paul wrote it shortly after 1 Thessalonians, or a later disciple of Paul wrote it so that you would read it as though it was written shortly after 1 Thessalonians, carrying on the story. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are two. So we start with 2 Thessalonians 1, the coming judgment of Jesus. With chapter 2, Jesus' return and the lawless one, and then chapter 3, prayers and warnings against idleness. The author wants the reader to not be disheartened when they face persecution. They need to not only stand strong, but know that one day all persecution they face will be judged and punished. They also want the reader to understand the reality of Jesus' return. It has not happened yet. There will be much turmoil and rebellion before that point, but when Jesus does return, he will do away with all of that easily. And finally, the author wants to address idleness and those causing problems in the church because of it. But let's jump into today's reading, 2 Thessalonians 1-3. Paul, I'll assume that Paul is talking from here on out, gives the Thessalonians a quick greeting and thanksgiving. Their faith is continuing to grow, as is their love. Then Paul jumps into the letter. The Thessalonians' growing love and faith is evidence of God's work in them. It is preparing them for his kingdom, and it is this kingdom that they are suffering for. One day, as Paul mentioned previously, Jesus will return, and that will be a day where the Lord brings judgment on the earth. The people who persecute the Thessalonians now will face judgment and punishment on that day. In fact, anyone who does not know God or does not obey the gospel of Jesus will be punished. In short, anyone who hasn't allowed themselves to be shaped into the image of Jesus. Those people will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction, separated from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. That's 2 Thessalonians 1:9. This is talking about what many would describe as hell, and it raises many questions. Does eternal destruction mean destroyed for eternity? So in other words, a person is destroyed and there's no hope of them ever being resurrected, they're always gone? Or does it mean that they are being destroyed for eternity? In other words, continuous destruction for all eternity. What does it mean to be separated from the presence of the Lord? Some argue that as all things are sustained by God's presence, if someone is separated from it, then they would cease to exist. Others argue that Paul is saying these people will no longer have access to God, which is its own punishment. These questions are to be wrestled through when working out the theology of hell, but it's worth noting this is probably the closest that Paul gets to talking about hell in any of his letters, and the phrase hell itself is not used. But all this will happen when Jesus returns in glory. While the Thessalonians may be facing persecution and wondering if it's all worth it, Paul wants them to know that Jesus is in control. He will return one day and he will make it all right. So Paul prays that God continues to support the Thessalonians, to continue to work in them and to strengthen them in their resolve and faith. Next up, Paul addresses the day of the Lord, as it seems that some are claiming the day of the Lord is already here. This could mean a couple of things. There could be some amongst the Thessalonians that argue that Jesus has already come and gone again and they missed it. Or it could be that their Jewish persecutors, who are also drawing on the Old Testament idea of the day of the Lord, are arguing that the Thessalonians are facing persecution because God is bringing judgment on them. Either way, Paul wants to warn them to not get caught up with these claims and to encourage them that there are things that need to happen before Jesus returns. He describes a rebellion that needs to come and a lawless one who is the son of destruction. Some translations translate this as destined for destruction, but a better way to understand it is this lawless one is the embodiment of lawlessness and chaos. They are anti-creation and destroy and decreate wherever they go. This lawless one will set themselves above God. Paul is drawing on similar imagery in the Old Testament where leaders and kings set themselves above God. See Daniel 11:36, Ezekiel 28:2, and Isaiah 14:13 for examples. Paul then points out he has mentioned all this to the Thessalonians before and that they already know what is restraining the lawless one until it is time to reveal him. There is little agreement on what this restrainer is. Some argue it is God or the Holy Spirit. Others argue it is the mission to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. Regardless, Paul points out that the moment that the lawless one is revealed, Jesus will just destroy them with the breath of his mouth. It will be easy, as simple as breathing. And in doing so, Jesus will remove the impact of this lawless one. This lawless one is somehow in line with Satan, either sent by him or moving in the same power as he. They will come with power and false signs and wonders. They will deceive many who did not choose God. Paul specifically says that God sends them a strong delusion, another complicated phrase. Some argue that just as in the Old Testament, this is God actively deluding those who have already turned from him so that they are condemned by their actions. Others who don't like this idea argue it is God allowing those who have turned from him to be deluded. With both, we need to keep in mind that Paul is encouraging the Thessalonians in their persecution, that God will eventually deal with and punish their persecutors. This can't mean then that God is actively restricting himself from those who just don't know him yet, particularly as Paul is actively trying to share Jesus with more and more people. That would discourage the Thessalonians from sharing the gospel. Whatever option, when it comes to the Thessalonians, they should give thanks to their God for their salvation and faith, and they should stand firm in all that Paul has taught them. Paul then ends this section with another prayer that God will comfort and establish the Thessalonians. Next, Paul asks the Thessalonians for prayer for him and his team as they face persecution, just as the Thessalonians are facing persecution. He asks that he be rescued from those who are evil, as there are still so many who don't know Jesus who need to hear about him. He then encourages them likewise that God will strengthen and guard them from evil as they continue in all that God is doing in them. Next up is idleness. There are clearly some amongst the Thessalonians that are continuing to be idle despite Paul's instructions in the last letter. It may even be that some have set themselves up as spiritual leaders and are then insisting that the church provide for their needs so that they don't have to. Paul tells the Thessalonians to avoid these people, as they are not following what Paul taught or modelled. When Paul and the team were with the Thessalonians, they weren't idle. They worked hard to provide for themselves. They weren't a drain on the Thessalonians. Paul gives this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. That's 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10. Note he doesn't say anyone unable to work should not eat, but anyone unwilling. This shouldn't be used to restrict support to those unable to support themselves. So anyone amongst them who is not working but is being a busybody should get back to work. If anyone doesn't follow this instruction, then the Thessalonians should avoid them, warning them that they need to repent and change. Finally, Paul ends with greetings. 2 Thessalonians is a complex letter that for many provides more questions than answers. It raises questions about hell and end times, but the underlying goal is clear: to encourage readers that Jesus is still in control, that there may be persecution or wickedness around, but one day Jesus will deal with it and remove it, and that in the meantime it requires believers to be faithful and hardworking, to allow themselves to be shaped in the image of Jesus, and that work spreading the gospel of Jesus so that others might know him and avoid judgment. That is the second letter to the Thessalonians. Now let's look at Psalm 15. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of liturgical psalm, read out as part of a worship service. It was most likely used at the beginning of a service as God's people entered his presence. Here's a summary of the structure. We have verse 1, questions concerning the Lord's dwelling place. Verse 2, positive requirements of dwelling with the Lord. Verse 3, the negative requirements of dwelling with the Lord. Verse 4, positive requirements of dwelling with the Lord. First part of verse 5, negative requirements of dwelling with the Lord. And then the second part of verse 5, a promise that those who pursue those requirements may dwell with the Lord. The psalm opens asking the question, who can enter the God's presence? That's my paraphrase. This is an important question to ask yourself as you go to enter God's presence. The rest of the psalm then seeks to answer that question. The first three traits offered are that a person should walk blamelessly, do right, and speak the truth. This is then mirrored by three things a person should avoid. There should be nothing false in their talking, they should do no evil, and they shouldn't go around accusing others. Then comes the next set. A person must despise the wicked and honour those who fear God, and they should swear to do good and hold to the word. Finally are two more things a person shouldn't do. They shouldn't loan out money and they expect interest, and this could trap someone in an oppressive spiral of debt, nor should they accept bribes and oppress innocents. The promise of this psalm is that if a person holds to all these things, they are able to stand in God's presence and not be removed. We see in this psalm that there are things in life that we should be working towards and things we should be avoiding. This psalm seeks to remind us that we are able to enter God's presence but not take it lightly. It should require a preparing of our hearts and appropriate reverence to God's holiness. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.